So I'm going to be talking about mobile security and mobile standards today. A little bit about how the interaction works between what the council does, the PCI SSC council, and what EMVCo does when it comes to mobile and also just the standards process. So more audience participation. I apologize about this. Who's here has heard of PCI SSC? Come on, once again, if you don't put your hand up, you're in the wrong conference. Okay, so who here knows about EMVCo? Okay, more people put their hand up. This is a PCI conference. Once again, I'm quite surprised. Okay, do you understand the difference between what PCI SSC does and EMVCo does as it relates to general terminals and as it relates to mobile devices and mobile acceptance? That's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. So from a PCI SSC point of view, we look at the security of the payments processing, the security of the devices, whether they be a POI device or potentially applications that are being run on a COTS system. We look at the security of PIN entry, how the PIN is entered, how the PIN is managed, how the PIN is encrypted. And we look at the security of the account data processing both during and after the processing, the entry of the account data into the system. We look at the terminals and the key management that goes on with those terminals in both the back end when they're loaded, key loading, whether that's in kind of person key loading in a KIF, in a key injection facility, another one of those TLAs, or whether it is remote key injection. We look at the security essentially of that process from when the cardholder data is used to make a payment all the way through to when that payment is processed and managed, and the life cycle of that when it's stored and managed, stored, transmits, and processed. From an EMVCo point of view, they look at how these things work in terms of the payment process, the functionality, if you like, the physical properties and the security properties of the payment instruments. When I say payment instruments, you would have heard earlier on today, we're talking about how we might have actually hit kind of peak plastic, and we're moving to more and more people using mobile phones, using watches, using other things to make payments. And so I'll refer to things as payment instruments potentially, or payment cards, but it's important to note that I may not always be talking about a physical card, a thing that you use to make a payment. So EMVCo specify physical properties for those, the security properties for those payment instruments, the protocols for how those systems work, and they communicate between that payment instrument and the terminal. How that works at the physical layer, how that works at the protocol layer, and how that works potentially from an end-to-end transaction point of view as well. They look at the security of the chips. If you have a payment card, it'll have a chip on generally these days. The security of that chip, what is done to validate that that chip is secure, that's managed by EMVCo. And the software that might be used on a mobile phone, if you're going to put your card data potentially in your mobile phone and make payments with your mobile phone, as opposed to accepting payments with your mobile phone, which is something that would be something that the council would look at. And they also, from an EMVCo point of view, look at the security of authentication on those payment instruments. So I've got an acronym there, CDCVM, Consumer Device Cardholder Verification Method. This is essentially when you have your phone and you authenticate onto that phone with a PIN, with a biometric, with a fingerprint, with a face recognition, whatever it is, and that allows you to make a payment potentially without entering a PIN into the terminal. It's referred to as CDCVM. The security of that in terms of how that is done, how that is managed, the software that manages that, that is managed by EMVCo as well. Let's look at some examples of how that might work here. So if you have offline PIN, we're talking about PINs here. You enter your PIN into a terminal to make a payment, to authorize a payment. There's essentially two different ways that can be processed. There is an offline PIN process and there is an online PIN process. So in the offline PIN process, you enter your PIN, and that PIN is sent directly to your payment card, and the payment card then validates whether that PIN is correct, because it can check if your PIN is correct in that context. The protocol for how the card communicates to the terminal to start that transaction, the protocol for how the PIN is encrypted and sent to that card, that's all managed by EMVCo and their standards. The security of the terminal, the security of the cryptographic keys on the terminal that help secure the applications and so forth, and the data that is transferred to the card, that is managed by PCI SSC in terms of standardization. So you've got online PIN then. An online PIN is where you enter your PIN, so same sort of transaction, and in fact from a user point of view they can look identical. You insert your card, you enter your PIN, but instead of that PIN being sent to the card, it is instead being sent to a back-end system. Generally that'll go all the way back to your issuer. So for example, I'm from Australia. If I made a payment with my card here that required a PIN, I would enter my PIN. That PIN would probably, because my cards would probably prefer to use an online PIN, that PIN would be sent all the way back to my issuer in Australia to validate that my PIN is correct. In that context, the EMV transaction, once again, when you plug in your card or you tap your card, how the communications work, the protocol, what's decided in terms of the type of CD-CVM or CVM that is being used, that's specified by EMVCo how that works. The security of the device where you enter your PIN and the security of the cryptographic keys that encrypt that PIN and allow for it to be sent back to other systems, which then perform what's called PIN translation, re-encrypt that PIN so that it can go through many hops back to my issuing bank. That's all managed within the PCI standards. And then we have this CD-CVM thing. So cardholder device, consumer device cardholder verification method. Sorry, I apologize there. So this is where you have your mobile device, generally, that you are going to use to make a payment, not accept payments. You're going to pay with your mobile phone, and you're going to tap your mobile phone, because they don't really fit into the card insertion slot. You're going to tap your phone onto that contactless area on that terminal. The authentication process, how you validate that, the way in which that data is secured on that phone from a transaction point of view, where that phone is being used as a card, that is all specified by EMVCo as well. And so when we look at this then, and we look at kind of how acceptance might work in a mobile environment. We've talked about using your mobile phone potentially as a payment instrument. You're going to take that mobile phone and you're going to use it as a payment acceptance device. There's also a bit of a split then in terms of how EMVCo standards and PCI standards work together to help ensure that that can be done in an interoperable, a seamless, and a secure way. So from the PCI SSC point of view, we have our standards. MPOC is an example of this, of how you can ensure that data is entered securely onto that mobile device, and how that can be passed in a secure way, encrypted through to a back-end processing environment. That back-end processing environment, potentially if it's handling pins, might be required to be validated against the PCI PIN standard. We have requirements around attestation and monitoring, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. That's about remotely being able to query these devices and the applications on these devices to make sure they're secure. And these requirements are stipulated, are presented in the MPOC standard around the MPOC software, the attestation and monitoring service, and the MPOC solution that allows for that transaction processing to occur once the cardholder data has been entered into the device. From an EMVCo point of view, they have requirements and standards about the communication between that payment instrument, the card, potentially a phone, that talks to this acceptance device, to make sure that that can work in an interoperable way. I can take my payment card from Australia and I can use it in a device that is in Malaysia or in Dublin or in Portland or anywhere around the world. They also have requirements around how you validate that the contactless interface works in an interoperable, seamless way. And so EMVCo are introducing recently their tap-to-mobile requirements that talk about different levels of contactless interface that might be possible depending on whether it's a fully fledged terminal device or whether it is a mobile phone type device. In the general terminals that you see, you pay with in a store or something like this, the contactless volume, it's called, the distance at which the card should work from that landing point for the card on that terminal, it's about 5 centimeters. So you can technically, and you can try this, you can technically hold your card about 5 centimeters off that terminal and that should work. These mobile devices, the contactless interfaces don't work as well as that because they're not designed solely and primarily to accept payments. And so the EMVCo tap-to-mobile requirements are about specifying a new contactless volume. It's 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters beyond that landing zone on those devices. They also do things like CD-CVM testing, as mentioned. So that aside now, we talked about the interactions and how PCI SSC and EMVCo work together. Let's talk a little bit about MPOC because MPOC's very exciting. So we have released our MPOC standard. We have the labs validating against the MPOC standard. The portal is open and we're receiving reports for MPOC at the moment. What does it do? And so the intention for MPOC is to allow for secure acceptance of payment transactions on these types of devices, mobile phones and tablets. We call them COTS devices or commercial off-the-shelf devices. And throughout the history of the council, we've had a couple of standards that came before MPOC. We had SPOC and CPOC that came before. And throughout those standards being used, we were hearing people wanted more flexibility. They wanted more options. They wanted to be able to have card data and pins entered on the same devices, which was not possible with the SPOC and CPOC standards. So that is what we have done with MPOC. MPOC allows for 3 different types of MPOC product, we call it, to be listed. That includes an MPOC software product, an attestation and monitoring service, and an MPOC solution. And I'll go through what those mean a little bit later on. There are some requirements that we have with the MPOC program, and that is that you must have the ability to support at least one form of chip-based acceptance. MPOC is not designed only for manual entry. It is not designed only for magnetic stripe card acceptance. It can support those modes, but is primarily designed to support either contactless or contact chip acceptance. You must have some form of what we call COTS native data entry as well. And what we mean by that is you have to have either the card data being read through the NFC on the phone or the PIN being entered onto the user interface of that mobile device. It is not the intention for MPOC to have a normal terminal, if you like, a traditional terminal that is using the mobile phone purely as a communications device, as a modem, because in that case, there's no scope for the valuation of this sort of device here. So no PIN entry, no MSR, no use of external devices that not an SCRP or not a non-PTS approved MSR. That's on a solution basis, on an MPOC product basis. You can absolutely have an MSR only transaction. That's fine. A manual PAN transaction. That's fine. You can't have a solution that only supports magnetic stripe. You can't have a solution that only supports manual pan. That's not within the scope of what MPOC allows. Now, I talked about COTS and commercial off-the-shelf devices. And so we have some definitions around what COTS devices are. We have some definitions around what COTS devices are not. So absolutely, the primary focus, the intent, if you like, of the standard is mobile type devices, tablets, those sorts of things. And so you could have, your mobile device running Android or iOS. Absolutely, that would be the sort of thing that could be included within the baseline of what a COTS device is within an MPOC solution. You could also have one of these devices that does not run Android or iOS. There is nothing in the MPOC standard that says you must support or you must only deploy on Android or iOS. It might be a different operating system. We do have some baseline requirements for those operating systems, but as long as it meets that, we don't intend to restrict the market to only certain operating systems. We do intend to make sure that the operating systems that are used provide sufficient security. So you can have a mobile device or tablet that does not run Android or iOS. You can have a non-consumer or commercial device. In some of the previous standards, we were very specific that it must be kind of a mass market, freely available, or literally off-the-shelf device. We don't have that requirement in MPOC. It can be a commercial device. And it doesn't have to be something that implements, kind of a common store or distribution method for the distribution of these applications, these MPOC applications. So it doesn't have to implement, for example, Google Play or distribute the application through Google Play. You could use, for example, a mobile device management system to do that. In the negative example then, things that are not suitable to be included in the consideration of what's a COTS device would be a bareboard computer, like a Raspberry Pi or a BeagleBoard, something that's just a computing board. That's not a device someone uses. That's a component. That is not something that is able to be considered under the MPOC program. A device that integrates an SCRP into a single form factor, we have requirements that this COTS device cannot be designed for payments. It must be a device that is being used for payments, but is not primarily designed for payments. And so when you integrate an SCRP, the only reason you do that is to provide for payments acceptance. An SCRP is required to encrypt all cardholder data that comes out of it, all of the data that comes out of it. It's not going to be able to be used for anything else except payments, and therefore that makes that device that integrates that SCRP, it makes it a payment device. A device that uses an external NFC antenna. I talked at the start of this presentation that the contactless volume, the distance at which you can use a card effectively on these devices isn't always as good as your traditional terminals. And so you might say, well, that's fine. I'm going to plug into this device some sort of USB-based antenna. The MPOC program does not support that because we don't have a good assurance around how that's going to be secured. And we don't approve in a similar way multi-part products where you might have perhaps the card being read by a watch and then most of the processing being done by a phone. It must be in some sort of single form factor. So I talked about the three different MPOC products, and those three products, the MPOC software product, the attestation and monitoring service, and the MPOC solution, they're designed to allow for flexibility in the implementation of these systems. So when we're looking at how you might have an MPOC solution created and listed as part of the listing program, you could create what we call a monolithic solution. So something where, as a vendor, you have done everything yourself. You've created the software, you've created the attestation monitoring service, you're running it, that's all fine. So in a similar way to how the solutions were required to be deployed under SPOC and CPOC, you can do that. Monolithic, no problem. You would have the applications, one or more, that are supported by that solution listed as part of that monolithic solution. However, if you didn't want to do all of that work yourself, you could look for a MPOC software product that is already listed on the PCI SSC website that has MPOC SDKs and or applications listed as part of that. And you might say, I'm going to take that MPOC software product and I'm going to use that as part of my overall MPOC solution. You still need to have as that solution the operating aspects evaluated. You still need to have the applications validated that you're using, or at least listed. They might have been validated prior in the MPOC software product, but they would still need to be listed in the solution. Or maybe those applications are going to include the SDKs that are part of that MPOC software product, and then they would need to be validated under the domain 2 of MPOC. And then finally, you might say, well, I don't want to run the attestation and monitoring service myself. I just really want to do the payment side, the payment solution part. And so you can then reference an MPOC software product. You can then reference an attestation and monitoring service that is using that MPOC software product. And you can build on top of that an MPOC solution that has, once again, applications and is using those software products and that attestation and monitoring service. Let's talk about the software product for a second. So that software product is tested against the technical domains of MPOC. There are 5 domains in MPOC, and the first 2, domains 1 and 2, what we refer to as the technical domains. They look at the software, how the software is developed, what exactly the software does, and how you integrate potentially an SDK into an application. However, there are operational aspects that aren't covered in those 2 domains. How does the key management actually work? You've got the technical aspects of what it does with the keys in the software, but how are the keys being managed in the back-end environment? How are they being generated? How are they being deployed? How is the application being distributed? How is that being secured? What is the merchant relationship, and how is the merchant informed when their device perhaps is getting too old and needs to be updated to remain secure? How does the attestation and monitoring service actually work? How are people responding to the alerts that are being generated by that system, and what happens with that process and that policy? All of these aspects are assessed when the MPOC applications, when that MPOC software product is integrated into an overall solution, or potentially an attestation monitoring service if that's the MPOC product under evaluation. And so you can build these MPOC applications in different ways. You can build the applications in a completely monolithic way. Once again, that's you doing it all yourself. You're not relying on some sort of SDK that is part of a listed MPOC software product. You can build an application, however, with an MPOC SDK that is part of an MPOC software product. And that's actually an important kind of aspect there when I say an SDK that is part of an MPOC software product. The SDK itself is not the complete MPOC software product. An MPOC software product includes an SDK and or applications, as well as attestation and monitoring software that it can be used to validate the security of those applications that are either monolithic or can integrate the SDKs. Now, depending on how you build those applications, they're then validated in different ways. If you have an MPOC software product that has what's referred to as an isolating SDK, that SDK has been evaluated as part of that MPOC software product to secure its assets, to secure its memory, to secure the interfaces it's using, and so forth. In that context, there is essentially a lighter evaluation just against Section 2A of the MPOC standard that's performed against those applications, essentially to validate that the integration of the SDK has been done in the correct way. They've followed the guidance, they haven't broken anything, they're not doing something that wasn't considered as part of the SDK during the initial evaluation. So I'm going to give you an example of how this might work kind of in practice. So you have an MPOC solution provider This provider then implements MPOC software. Now, they could list that MPOC software product. That would include an MPOC SDK and or MPOC applications, as well as attestation and monitoring software. But it does not include the operational aspects of that. Those operational aspects include the attestation and monitoring service that is the operational aspects of that attestation and monitoring software that is part of that MPOC software product. So either the solution provider themselves, in this example, or somebody else, takes the attestation and monitoring software and then operates that, literally, runs it, manages it, performs the key management that's associated with that. You then have, as part of this overall MPOC solution, applications that are listed as well. Those applications could be applications that are developed entirely by the solution provider. They could be other people's applications, but they must be listed as part of the solution that they operate within, because they need to plug in to the rest of the solution. For example, they need to communicate and be managed by, from a security aspect, the attestation and monitoring service that is validating those environments. So the attestation and monitoring service is used to confirm that the application is correct. The application hasn't been tampered with in some way, and also to confirm that the operating environment, the operating system, if you like, the device on which that application runs is secure and correct, and there are not other aspects that could be suspicious. Maybe it's something that has been changed around a lot between different merchants, and that could be maybe a merchant was flagged as being suspicious and they pop up with a different device later on. That's what your attestation monitoring service is designed to look at. Then you have your acquiring, your financial aspects that are part of this as well. And that's where you would do your PIN acceptance, your PIN validation, potentially your PIN translation. You would do your payment processing and decrypting, essentially where the financial key management occurs. And there's multiple aspects of key management here. The attestation monitoring service is key management to make sure that the attestation monitoring data is secured. In the acquiring systems or the financial systems, there is key management to make sure that the cardholder data is secured as well. So the MPOC solution provider can implement all of this themselves. And that's fine. That can be done as one monolithic thing. However, they could also build on top of MPOC software products, attestation and monitoring services that are provided by other listed entities, and they operate the operational aspects, the key management aspects and so forth that go on with that. Now, there's also the possibility for there to be not a direct acquiring system, but a payment switch that is part of an MPOC solution provider, and that payment switch then operates out to different acquiring systems, different acquirers, different payment service providers, whatever it is. There are requirements in MPOC that there must be a demonstrable communication path to the merchant. That does not mean that the MPOC solution provider must be the holder of the financial relationship for that merchant. What it means is there are some assumptions that we've built MPOC on top of that include, for example, that these COTS devices can become less secure over time as the operating system gets older, as new vulnerabilities are found, and therefore at some point there might need to be communication to that merchant that they need to change their COTS device. Or perhaps that COTS device has been detected as being suspicious by the attestation and monitoring service. There needs to be some communication then to that merchant that those systems are considered suspicious and that might affect their ability to perform transactions. Move on. So we also have, as part of MPOC, a 3-year listing cycle. Basically, you have a listing, let's say, on the 1st of January 2024. Then every calendar year thereafter, 2025, January 1st, you would need to submit an annual checkpoint. We actually allow within the MPOC standard up to 180 days of grace period. So if you haven't submitted on the 1st of January 2025 for your annual checkpoint that was started in the from that submission in the 1st of January 2024, that's okay. We allow for up to 180 days, essentially almost the middle of 2025 from that point of view, for you to submit that. There will be indicators on the website showing that your submissions are late, and after 180 days, then those submissions will not be, the annual checkpoints will not be accepted, and you'll need to resubmit. And I want to be very clear about this because at that point, if you submit an annual checkpoint, or if your lab submits an annual checkpoint on day 181 after your annual checkpoint was due, that submission is not a day late, it's 181 days late. And so I would recommend that you try and make sure that you get it in on time, or at least fit it in within that window. Now, I mentioned that MPOC was built on certain assumptions. These assumptions include that new threats and vulnerabilities will be found over time. It includes that implementations can issue software updates, but those software updates must be protected, just as those software updates might protect the implementation. It includes assumptions that there are the ability to detect attacks through active attestation and monitoring, not necessarily after the fact, but potentially during the process of these systems being attacked. And that implies then there is the ability to respond to potential attacks before that sensitive data is compromised, and then recover operations through ongoing security. So these foundational assumptions that build on that are that the solution vendor does not control these platforms. You don't make the Android phone, you don't make the tablets that are being used, but you are deploying software on that. And that changes the security environment, and that is one of the reasons why we need this robust attestation and monitoring system. Another assumption is that security changes over time. COTS platforms change over time. And so there needs to be an approach that accommodates for that changing threat landscape. And there needs to be active processes to manage that. It includes the assumption, and in fact the correct assumption, that EMV-based transactions provide additional security when compared to magnetic stripe and manual PAN, which is why we don't allow for only manual PAN or only magnetic stripe transactions to be performed. Primarily, these standards are based or aimed at chip-based acceptance. Through this, basically what we're looking at is a solution that is not a point-of-time solution. It's not something you create, you list, and then you don't change, you don't address, you don't do anything with. There are essentially business as usual practices that are baked into these assumptions because these solutions are designed to be secured over time, to be managed, to be updated. They're not a point-in-time solution, essentially. And so that leads to some of the requirements that we have in these annual checkpoints. Now, I don't expect people to read these, that's on there. This is taken from the program guide, but essentially what this says is there are business as usual expectations that are based on those assumptions that help build this whole standard and program. So last year, I like showing last year's slides. Last year I presented this exact slide. If you're wondering why it says 2022, it's not a mistake. It's a slide from last year. And I was talking at community meetings saying that we are expecting to have the MPOC standard and the MPOC program released at the end of 2022. And so we managed that. We got the standard out, we got the program guide out, we have also subsequently released and continue to release technical FAQs. There's a new tranche of technical FAQs that will be coming out very soon, so please look out for those. They're very important. We also have the attestation documents that go along with the submission on these products as well. We will continue to maintain these documents, and we did an errata of the standard earlier on this year to version 1.0.1. So in summary then, EMVCo and PCI SSC work together to help secure payments, and help secure, particularly in this context, mobile payments from the protocol side, the functionality side from EMVCo, and from the operational security and the processing side from the PCI SSC point of view. The EMVCo Tap to Mobile plan of standard focuses on the operational aspects, and the PCI MPOT program focuses on the security aspects. When you look at this picture was actually taken a long time ago, 8 years ago. That seems like a long time. Does that seem like a long time to you? That is myself and actually the person who is now the technical director of EMVCo. We were talking about mobile acceptance and the security of mobile acceptance back in 2015. Now, if you have a look at the PCI website, next week, probably, we will have a new podcast that's released where both Armin, who's the technical director, and myself talk through some more of these aspects of how EMVCo and PCI SSC work together. So I would suggest if you had interest in this talk, that might be of an interest to you as well. So if you have any more questions on this, hunt me down later on today. I'll be happy to talk to you at depth. Thank you very much.